On the evening of January 13th, 2002, a 42-year-old man named Ronald Huff walked in the door of his studio apartment in the city of Newark, Delaware. He had just come back from visiting his grandmother, and now he was feeling really sick. Inside of his apartment, it was blazing hot, but that was by design. That's how he kept the temperature. Ronald took off his coat and threw it over one of the many handmade wooden cages that were strewn about his living room. Then he dragged himself over to his house phone, picked it up, and he called the auto dealership where he worked. When the office manager answered, Ronald told her that he would not be able to come into work the following day because he was feeling so unwell. He hung up the phone and then leaned on the counter for a second, feeling lightheaded. Then suddenly, from behind him, he heard a hiss. Right away, Ronald turned around and walked over to his fridge, and instinctively, he reached out his right hand to open the door. But as soon as he grabbed the handle and squeezed, he felt a shot of pain in his right hand. He had forgotten that his right hand was all bandaged up because it was injured. And so grimacing, Ronald reached out with his left hand and he opened up the fridge that way. Then, after shutting the fridge, he walked over to the kitchen counter and he reached into a jar and he pulled out a whole fistful of live cockroaches. They were about 2 inches long each and they wriggled around inside of his hand. He threw the cockroaches onto the ground and then watched as they scattered. Now that Ronald's chores were finished, he decided he would just go lay down because again, he's feeling horrible. But as he walked across the kitchen towards his bedroom, that dizziness he was feeling earlier came back. And suddenly it was like the whole world was spinning around him and he could barely stay on his feet. He kept trying to walk towards his bedroom, but he just couldn't do it. And eventually he stumbled and began to fall. Ronald lurched sideways and blindly stumbled to the right, trying to catch himself. And the first thing he touched with his outstretched arm was the door to his apartment. And so he grabbed it and he tried to stay on his feet, but he couldn't. And so he turned his body around and pressed his back up against the door to steady himself. But he was just so woozy and weak that eventually he just kind of slouched down to the ground, back against the door, feet out in front of him. Slowly, he let his eyes close. As Ronald passed out, all he could hear were the sounds of roaches scurrying and chicken bones crunching. 3 days later, Ronald's neighbor heard the crackle of police walkie-talkies out in the hallway. He opened his door and he saw 2 police officers and the superintendent of their building standing in front of Ronald's door. So this neighbor liked Ronald and knew him to be a nice, quiet guy, and so he couldn't imagine why police would be at his door. But then he thought about it, and he actually hadn't seen Ronald in several days. The neighbor watched as the police officers knocked on Ronald's door, waiting for Ronald to come out, but the door never opened. And after a few minutes of knocking, the police finally stepped back from the door and gestured for the superintendent to step forward and use his key to open the door. And then after the superintendent had done that, the neighbor watched as the police officers tried to open the door, but couldn't. It was like there was something really heavy blocking the door from opening. Finally, both police officers leaned hard enough on the door that they got it to open up just a little bit. The neighbor watched as the officers stuck their heads into the apartment and then jumped back with their hands on their guns. Then one of the cops grabbed their radio and began frantically talking into it, and then the neighbor watched as the officers and the superintendent quickly walked down the hallway out of sight, leaving Ronald's apartment door partially open. And as the neighbor heard the sound of sirens wailing outside, he took a cautious step into the hallway and realized he could actually see into Ronald's apartment through the open door. And what he saw inside of there was so horrifying that for a second the neighbor just froze. And then a second later, he backed into his own apartment and slammed the door behind him. Hours later, this neighbor could not get the image of what he had seen in Ronald's apartment out of his head. So he grabbed a piece of paper and just began sketching the bizarre scene. It would turn out Ronald had a secret. And on the evening of January 13th, 2002, right after Ronald had called in sick to his work, that secret killed him. Here is the picture that the neighbor drew of what he saw inside of Ronald's apartment. On the floor is Ronald's dead body. His face, his ears, his hands, and his internal organs had all been eaten. And surrounding Ronald were the giant monitor lizards that he was secretly keeping as pets. He had 7 of them, which he fed roaches and raw chicken and allowed to just free roam his apartment. They ranged in size from 2 feet to 6 feet long. These are massive lizards, and unfortunately for Ronald, not only are monitor lizards carnivores, but also their mouths are filled with deadly bacteria. The reason Ronald's hand was bandaged up, his right hand, is because one of his lizards, a week prior to his death, had bit his hand, and the bacteria had given him this horrible staph infection. And it was that staph infection a week later that very likely caused him to pass out inside of his apartment. And then after that, he was eaten by the lizards. Now, it's assumed he died from the staph infection and then was consumed. However, the autopsy couldn't prove that, and so it is possible he may have been still alive when they began to eat him. After Robert's death, his lizards were taken from his apartment and placed in the Catoctin Wildlife Preserve and Zoo in Thurmont, Maryland. One evening in the late winter of 1973, a 23-year-old mother named Tabby put her 8-month-old son and 2-year-old daughter down for their naps inside of their double-wide trailer, which was parked in a small town in New England. Once her kids fell asleep, Tabby looked over at the clock. She was waiting for her husband to get home from his job as a high school teacher, and he was running late. Tabby wondered, what could be holding up her husband. She certainly hoped he was okay, but she couldn't just call the high school to ask how he was doing because they didn't own a landline phone. They literally didn't have enough money to afford a landline phone in their trailer. In fact, they basically only had enough money to barely make ends meet. So Tabby and her husband actually had dreams of becoming professional writers. But they had found over the past few years that breaking into writing at this time in America was nearly impossible. They had gotten a few stories published here and there, but for the most part, the only thing their writing had gotten them was a whole bunch of rejection. And so as a result of this, both of them had taken day jobs to basically supplement the income that was not being generated from writing. Tabby was home with the kids, and then in the evening would work some shifts at a Dunkin' Donuts. And then her husband, in addition to being a teacher, also worked at a laundromat. But even with their 3 jobs combined, they barely made any money. Now, Tabby still held on to hope that, maybe one day she could break in and be a professional writer and have that be her primary income. But her husband, who also, had the same dream, was over time becoming increasingly more pessimistic about his opportunity to, one day just be a writer. He sort of felt like this truly was impossible, that they'd struggle forever and he wouldn't become a writer. Tabby walked to the tiny laundry room in the back of their trailer to switch their clothes from the washer to the dryer. So this room, the laundry room, actually doubled as her husband's office. And as soon as she walked back there, she saw his desk was a total mess. All around his typewriter, which sat right in the middle of the table, were all these empty beer cans and food wrappers and rejection letters from various magazines and publications. And the trash can next to the table on the ground was overflowing with crumpled up pieces of paper. Feeling very annoyed by this mess, Tabby reached down to tie up the trash bag to take it outside. But as she went to do that, she happened to glance at one of these crumpled up pieces of paper in the trash, and she skimmed a couple of sentences that were written on it, that were typed on this paper. And as soon as she did, she stopped, because there was something really interesting about this writing. Now, she knew her husband had written whatever was on this page, but generally speaking, her husband always shared with her anything he had written, and she would read everything. And there was something about this text that she knew she had not read it before. Like, this was different. Clearly he wrote it, but she had not seen this before, and so she was curious. So she pulled the paper out of the trash can and smoothed it off, and actually began reading what turned out to be this failed manuscript that her husband had thrown away, and she couldn't believe how good it was. And so it dawned on Tabby that clearly her husband had been working on this in secret, which made her wonder, like, one, why are you doing that? Why are you hiding this particular thing from me when you let me read everything else? And two, again, this is so good, why is it crumpled up and in the trash? Just then, Tabby heard the front door of the trailer open and her husband come inside. And so Tabby just took the page she was reading and walked out of the laundry room, and she held it up to her husband and she was like, what is this? Why haven't you shown me this? And to Tabby's surprise, her husband, when he realized what she was holding, just looked totally embarrassed, like he wished she hadn't seen that. And she said to him, no, like, this is so good, what's going on here? And her husband would tell her, look, like, I started writing this thing, I didn't really know what it was going to become, but I quickly realized that I don't know enough about the subject matter, and, I'm just not talented enough to finish the story, and even if I was, like, this is too weird, it's too out there, no one would publish this. And so ultimately, he had just thrown it away and not told Tabby. And in fact, he went on to tell Tabby that in addition to this being a failed project, he really understood at this point in his career that he was a failed writer. And right now, what he really needed to do was give up writing altogether and just focus on making money for the family, something they desperately needed. Tabby could see her husband was completely serious. And so she just held up this piece of paper and she said, no, this is the one. This is the one that's gonna help you break through. I know it. And you know what? Even if you don't know the subject matter, I do. I can help you with that. And together, we can make this a full-length novel. You gotta see it through. It's too good not to. And so, at Tabby's insistence, that's what her husband did. He would spend several months working with Tabby to finish this novel, and by the spring of 1974, it was done. And so, that same spring, they began shopping the manuscript around to different publishers, really having no idea how anybody was going to react. But they were both totally blown away when one of the major publishers they sent this thing to came back and said, not only will we absolutely print this book, but we'll also give you a $400,000 advance, which in today's money is $2.5 million. A massive, massive book deal by any standard. And so the young couple was totally thrilled. They took the book deal, the book got published, and with the money they got, they were able to move out of their double-wide trailer, and they were able to purchase a landline telephone. But that was only the beginning. Tabby's decision to pull that crumpled up piece of paper out of the trash can and force her husband to turn it into a novel would prove to be a good one, because her husband would go on to become arguably one of the most famous writers in the world. That story, that Tabby saved from the trash can, would go on to become the iconic horror novel Carrie. Tabby's husband was none other than Stephen King. At 11:40 a.m. on November 29, 1986, a 36-year-old volunteer fire chief named Jack Schofstall parked his fire truck on a country road right next to this huge farm in rural Indiana. Jack was there with his assistant chief named Donald Schnitker. After parking, Jack looked down the road and he saw the owner of this farm, Jeffrey Wolf, was standing on the side of the road, waving to them and turning around and pointing back towards his property. And so Jack and Donald, they looked out the window, out in the direction that Jeff was pointing, and they saw there was this huge storage building off in the distance that clearly was part of the farm, and there appeared to be this thin plume of smoke coming off the top of it. And so Jack and Donald hop out of the fire truck, they hustle over to Jeffrey, and the three of them jog across the property over to this building. And when they get there, again, it's very clear that something is burning inside of this building. But this storage building was packed to the brim with stuff. Like there was no way to get into the storage building from the front. Really, the only way to actually look inside of this building to see what was burning is by climbing up this ladder that ran to the top of this, 80-foot tall building, where at the very top there was a window that looked down into the storage building. And so basically Jack and Jeff said they would climb the ladder up to the top. Donald, the assistant chief, he would stay on the ground, and Jack and Jeffrey would go up there, look inside, and see if they could actually figure out what was burning so they could make a decision about how to approach this, what equipment they might need and what to do. And so Jack and Jeff, they make their way up this ladder to the very top, they get to this window, and Jack, he looks inside, and again, it's very clear something is burning in here, but he can't tell where it's coming from. He sees smoke coming out right next to him, but it's just there's so much stuff inside of this building, you just can't tell where it's coming from. But Jeffrey clearly had placed this big piece of plywood on the very top of all the stuff inside of the storage building as sort of like a makeshift platform if you wanted to, walk inside of this building in the one area you could walk into. And so he turned to look at Jeffrey and he's like, yeah, you can stand on that. And so Jack climbed through the window. And so he gets on there and it's kind of like he's surfing, basically balancing on the top of all this stuff, at the very top of this massive building. And he's looking around, but now Jack has a better vantage point. He's sort of more in the center of this big building. And as he's looking around, he identifies where this fire is coming from. Now, this was not some enormous fire, but he really had no way to attempt to put it out without leaving the building, going back down, and getting more equipment. And so Jack, who's still standing on this piece of plywood, he pulls out his radio and he radios down to Donald, the assistant chief, who's down on the ground, and he says, hey, we located the fire, we're gonna come back down, get our equipment, we'll come back up here, we'll put this thing out, we'll be good. But after Jack put the radio back on his belt and he turned to walk back across this plywood, back to the window and down the ladder, before he got off the plywood, there was this low rumbling sound that came from right underneath his feet. At the same time, Donald, who's back down on the ground and who's just received this radio call from his partner saying, hey, we're gonna leave right now and get our equipment and put this fire out. Donald, he's down there staring up at the exit, up at the top there where Jack and Jeffrey had gone. And so far, he hasn't seen either of them come out of this building. It's just been silence. Like he heard a little bit of a rumbling sound inside of this building and he didn't really know what it was, but no one's coming out of the building. And he's thinking how strange that is. Like Jack just said he was coming out to get his equipment. Where is he? And so Donald grabs his radio and begins repeatedly calling Jack to say, hey, where are you? You said you were coming out. Where are you guys? What's going on? But he didn't get an answer. And so really quickly, Donald realized there could be an emergency inside of this building. Like for all we know, the fire is way worse and they're trapped or who knows what's going on. But based on protocol, Donald couldn't just on his own go charging up the ladder and go right in there to, save the day because he has no idea what he's walking into. He needs to make sure that he calls for help, gets other people here, and then can help explain what's going on here instead of he himself going up there and potentially being another casualty. And so instead of climbing that ladder, Donald began calling for help. And very quickly, an entire fleet of additional firefighters and police officers and ambulances showed up. I mean, there's all these people descending on the farm. And really quickly, first responders climbed up that ladder. They looked inside of the building and they figured out what happened. So when Jack climbed through that window at the top of this building, and he stood on top of that piece of plywood that Jeffrey had placed up there on top of all the stuff in the storage building. And he was standing there balancing himself as he's looking around for where this fire is. Eventually, that rumbling under his feet was all the stuff underneath the plywood shifting, and he sort of lost his balance, and Jack fell off the plywood into basically the sea of stuff inside the storage building. And Jeffrey, when he saw this happen, he had not fallen in, but he turned and basically tried to get in there and grab on to Jack to get him out. But he too inadvertently fell into what was inside of this building. And what was inside of this building was corn. This was an 80-foot tall grain silo packed to the brim with grain. And so that piece of plywood was resting on the surface of the grain. And so when Jack fell into the grain, it was like it swallowed him whole, like quicksand. And then Jeffrey, in an attempt to save Jack, also fell in, got swallowed whole, and they disappeared and suffocated. It would ultimately take nearly 3 hours for bulldozers to basically break apart this building and sift through all the corn to finally locate Jack and Jeffrey. In 2012, a 22-year-old woman named Simone was living in a small winemaking village called Rüdesheim am Rhein, which is located in southwestern Germany. This village is strikingly beautiful. It's full of quaint European homes, and there's lots of rolling green hills with vineyards as far as the eye can see, and the village sits right on the banks of the Rhine River. Simone had grown up in this picturesque village, and she had loved it, but this was going to be her last summer before she left and headed off to New York City to start the next chapter of her life. And while she was excited about that, she was also kind of sad because this village and everybody inside of it were the only things she had ever known. And so the idea of leaving them behind just seemed very strange to her. But instead of focusing on the kind of growing anxiety around her imminent departure from Germany, she focused on what she would be doing that summer while she was still in Germany. Some of Simone's fondest memories of her childhood were of her time spent at summer camp. And this summer camp was located in this forest that was not far from her village. And every summer in July, Simone, along with about 200 other kids from her village and from neighboring villages, would converge on the campgrounds in the forest for 2 weeks of playing games and going on scavenger hunts and putting on stage plays and just generally having a really good time. But when Simone became a teenager and was too old to be a camp attendee, she decided she would volunteer and be a camp counselor. And she found it was awesome. She immediately connected with the other camp counselors and she felt all grown up, having a real job, and she loved goofing around with all of the kids. And so every summer since that first time volunteering, Simone had gone back and volunteered again. And this summer was no different. So in mid-July of that year, Simone packed up her things and she headed off to the forest. The way this camp worked was the 200 plus kids that were attending the camp, they would get dropped off in the mornings each day by their parents and they'd play and run around all day. And then in the late afternoon, their parents would come back and pick them up. So none of the kids were sleeping over at the camp during these 2 weeks. However, the 30 plus counselors, they would just stay at the camp for the full 2 weeks. They would just sleep in tents out in the forest. Technically, the reason they did this was to make sure they had enough time in the morning to prep the campgrounds campgrounds for the kids, and then also in the evenings to have enough time to clean up and kind of have it ready for the next day. But in reality, Simone and the other counselors all knew that the camping out in the forest was the best part of the volunteer experience. After all the kids went home for the night, all of the counselors would finish up all of their duties and then rush off into the forest where their tents were and where there was a fire pit, and they would have some beers and wine because the legal drinking age in Germany is actually 16. So all these counselors are having a couple of drinks, and then before long they'd be laughing and telling stories and just generally having a great time. So that July in 2012, Simone and the other counselors arrived at the campgrounds a day early, and they caught up with each other and they prepared the campground. And then the next morning, all the kids showed up and everything went off without a hitch. And then that afternoon, after all the kids had been picked up by their parents, Simone and the other counselors rushed to finish up all their duties and then headed off into the woods to enjoy their first night hanging out together. After a couple of beers had been passed around the campfire, everybody was in good spirits and laughing and telling stories. But pretty quickly, people started to fade and get tired because, it was their first day back at camp and it had been a long, tiring day. And so people very gradually began retiring to their tents to go to bed. And eventually Simone too had crawled into her tent and gotten onto her cot to try to sleep herself. But she found that night it was so hot she couldn't be in her tent. It was stifling inside of there. And so she decides she's just gonna sleep out in the open where it's a little bit cooler. And so she picks up her fold-up cot and she brings it out into the open, and she sees there are several other counselors who have done the same thing. And so she puts her cot down next to one of her good friends who's already asleep in her cot. And then Simone climbs into her cot, she gets under her covers, and she tries to fall asleep. But for the next hour, Simone just tosses and turns, she can't get comfortable. And by that time, everybody else has completely passed out. So it's just her, she's counting down the time until she has to get up again to start the next day. And so she's getting stressed about that. But eventually she would fall asleep. However, she would immediately be thrust into one of the most visceral and intense nightmares she had ever had in her entire life. In her dream, she opens her eyes and she looks out in front of her, and it's this desert city, and there are hundreds of people all in front of her, just standing there looking up at her. And then she notices on her left and on her right are these two men, these big, huge men that are both working on something behind her. She doesn't really know what it is, but they're obviously busy doing something. And she kind of glances up at one of them and she notices he's holding something that looks like a wreath, like a holiday wreath you would hang on your door. And so Simone looks away from the guy with the wreath and just looks back out at this huge sea of people, which is totally bizarre because no one's moving, no one's making any sound, they're just staring at her. And then she feels this shooting pain in the top of her head. The man who was standing on her right was not holding a holiday wreath. He was holding a crown of thorns, and now he, along with the guy on the other side of her, were working together to press this crown of thorns into her head. And so Simone is feeling the thorns being pressed deeper and deeper into her scalp, and she tries to fight them off, but she realizes she can't move. She can't even turn her head to look at them. She can only see them out of her periphery vision. And then she tries to scream out for help to someone in the crowd to come help her, but when she opens her mouth, no sound comes out. And so as she's sitting there, all she can do is stare straight out ahead of her as the pressure of these thorns are driven deeper and deeper into her skin. And then at some point, blood begins dripping down in front of her eyes. And around that point, the pain became so blinding, so awful, that it woke her up. And as soon as she woke up, she shot up and she reached for her head to make sure there was no crown of thorns on her. And as she's doing that, she's thinking, okay, phew, it was just a dream. That was just a horrible dream. I'm in this forest. I'm good. I'm safe. And as she's kind of patting on her head, she's realizing her head is wet. And as she's touching her head, she's realizing it hurts. There's a stinging pain in her head. And then she realizes it's not just a stinging pain, it's a throbbing, intense pain all over her head. And so as she's kind of having this realization that her dream is now kind of segued into her real life, she looks out ahead of her and she sees off in the distance in the tree line, something is running through the woods. She can't tell who or what it is, but she makes a mental note that there is someone running away from them. But this pain in her head has gotten so intense that she can't focus on anything else. She can only focus on the pain. And as she's thinking about how much her head hurts, she screams in pain. And the girl who was laying next to her that had been asleep, she wakes up to the sound of the scream, but it's totally pitch black. She has no idea what's going on with Simone. And so this girl, she sits up and she's trying to get Simone to tell her what's going on, but Simone has no idea. She's totally frantic. She can't really make sense of what's happening. And so this friend, she reaches down and she picks up a flashlight, she turns it on, and she aims the light at Simone, illuminating her head. And when this friend sees Simone's head, she starts to scream. Seconds later, the rest of the counselors that had been sleeping out were awake, and they were rushing Simone, who was now shaking and vomiting, over to one of the staff vans. And then 15 minutes later, they had driven her to the emergency room. It would turn out, after Simone had finally fallen asleep and she began having that really intense dream about a crown of thorns being dug into her scalp, well, in reality, something was digging into her scalp, and it was kind of manifesting itself in her dream. And what was digging into her scalp was the jaws of a fox. This fox had snuck into the campsite and walked right up behind Simone and just started eating her head. And amazingly, it did not wake Simone up right away. And so this fox got 20 or so serious bites out of Simone's head before she shot up and scared it away. And so almost certainly what Simone saw running away from her in that quick moment was the fox. Doctors were able to save Simone and stitch her head back together, and they were even able to hide all of the scars in her hairline so you can't even see them. But despite her being physically okay today, psychologically, this was a very traumatizing event. Not only does she refuse now to go into any forest, whether it's day or night, but she also periodically still gets phantom pains in her scalp that feels like the fox is biting her head all over again. Strongsville, Ohio used to be just another typical quiet American suburb. Nice homes, nice families, nice restaurants, and a mall. But in late 2017, a discovery was made in Strongsville that put this town on the map in the worst way possible. To understand this discovery, we need to go back to early 2016 when this town's nightmare began. In early 2016, two longtime Strongsville residents, Bruce and Melinda Pleskovic, received some very exciting news. Their 20-year-old daughter named Anna and her 20-year-old fiance named Jeff had just told them they were expecting a baby girl. And so Bruce and Melinda were totally excited about the prospect of finally becoming grandparents, but at the same time, they knew Anna and Jeff did not have very much money. Anna still lived at home with Bruce and Melinda. She did have a job, but she made very little money. She was a waitress at a local Applebee's restaurant. And as for Jeff, he had a better job working as a service technician for a heating and air company, but he didn't have enough money to support him and Anna. In fact, he didn't even have enough money to move out of his parents' home. He was still living with them on the other side of Strongsville. And so this couple, they're really excited about their baby, but Bruce and Melinda are thinking, we really got to find a way to support them because they're just not prepared for this first child. And so Bruce and Melinda, they talked it over and they decided the best way to support this young couple was to tell their daughter, if she wanted to, she could invite Jeff to come stay at their house. That way the two of them could be together, and once they had their daughter, Bruce and Melinda could be the great-grandparents and help take care of the baby. And in general, this would allow the couple to just continue to save money and move out when they were ready. And so when they told Anna they were willing to do this, Anna was so happy, she was so grateful. She called Jeff, and Jeff was equally happy and grateful and said, yes, I would love to move in with you guys. So it took several months, but finally in June of 2016, which was the same month that Jeff and Anna welcomed their daughter to the world, Jeff would leave his parents' home and move into Bruce and Melinda's home. And almost immediately after he moved in, he and the rest of Anna's family began experiencing some very strange and disturbing things around their property. Just a few days after Jeff had moved in, he and Anna were home alone. They were on the main floor of the house and they were having dinner at the kitchen table. And at some point, Jeff just happened to glance out one of the back windows that looked out into their backyard. And now this property had this huge sprawling backyard. Basically, they had all these houses kind of in a row, and they all had almost like a communal backyard, this big open space. And so Jeff is looking out into this huge backyard, and he sees off in the distance something strange. He doesn't really know what he's looking at because it's nighttime, it's dark, but he stands up and he walks over to the window, and as he's looking out, he sees way off on the backside of their property are these four strangers just standing there, appearing to be smoking something, and they're just kind of looking up at the Pleskovic house. And so Jeff is looking out the window at these four, not really sure what to make of them, and he calls Anna over, and so Anna walks over, and the two of them are looking out, not really sure what to do. I mean, on the one hand, these four people who they clearly didn't know, or they believed they didn't know, were definitely trespassing. But at the same time, they weren't really doing anything. They were just kind of standing there smoking. But as they're watching these four people, one of them begins walking up the property towards their home and then stops alongside the Pleskovic trampoline, which was in their backyard. And this person begins fiddling with the trampoline. And so at this, Anna's like, you know what? I don't know what they're doing. I feel totally uncomfortable. And so Anna would actually call the police. And so the police, they come out, but by the time the squad car arrived in front of the Pleskovic house, the four people in back must have seen the car and they took off running. And so when the police officer went in the backyard and looked around, there was no one there, and there was also no sign they were there. There was no dropped cigarette butts or anything. They just kind of vanished. And so the police officer told Jeff and Anna, if they come back, let us know. And so the officer left. And then a little while later, when Bruce and Melinda came home, Jeff and Anna would tell them about what happened, and they would agree that that was totally strange, that in all the decades they had lived in Strongsville, they had never had anybody stroll onto their property and just loiter in the middle of the night. And so for the next couple of days, the family was definitely on edge, but after a little while, this whole incident was largely forgotten about. Fast forward about 5 months to November 2016, and Anna was home alone with her young daughter, and she's playing with her daughter on the first floor of the house towards the front of the house. And as she's playing with her daughter, she suddenly hears what sounds like someone trying to open the back sliding glass door on the back of the house. And so instinctively, Anna thinks, okay, Jeff must be out there, or my parents must be out there, and they don't have a key or something. And so she scoops up her daughter, and she begins walking towards the back of the house to open this door for them. And when she walks into one of the back rooms, before she reaches the back door, she happens to look out one of the windows that looked out into the backyard. And standing right up against the glass is this unknown male figure with his face pressed up against the glass. And so Anna just freezes and stares at this guy, and then this guy, he notices Anna and he ducks down out of view. And now Anna's thinking to herself, this is the guy. He must have been trying to break in my back door. I'm home alone. I don't know what's going on here. I don't know if he's going to try to break in again. And so she just turns and runs back towards the front of the house. She runs upstairs. She goes in the bedroom. She locks the door and she calls the police. But by the time the police come out there and they look around, they can't find this unknown figure that was at the back of the house. And there's no sign of an attempted forced entry. And so unfortunately they told her, look, I'm sure this was very traumatic for you, but there's really nothing we can do here. There's no evidence to suggest who did this. And so please just, keep your house locked. And if you see anybody suspicious on your property, call us back. And so naturally, after the police left and Anna had a chance to contact Jeff and her parents, they were horrified and they rushed home to comfort her. And then after the initial shock of this incident had worn off, the family began to speculate, do you think this might be connected to those four strangers we saw on our property a few months ago? It just seems odd that those two things would happen so close together. And then the family began to think, okay, well then who is this person? Who are these people? What do they want? Why are they targeting us? What's going on? Because as it was, the Pleskovic family, they didn't have any enemies, at least none that they knew of. If anything, the people of Strongsville adored this family, especially Melinda, the mother. For the past 20 plus years, she had been a middle school teacher in town and her students adored her. She was also a big time soccer coach in the community because she had played in college and she was still very passionate about it. So she was this amazing coach. And in the eyes of many parents in the Strongsville community, Melinda was a bit of an inspiration because she was not only the mother to Anna, she was also the mother of an 18-year-old boy named Kyle who had Down syndrome and was nonverbal. And Melinda just had this unbelievable way with him where she was so good to him. She incorporated him in everything. She got him so involved. She gave him the best life he could possibly have. And so anytime you saw Kyle with his mother, Kyle would be all smiles. words. Even though Kyle couldn't speak, it was so obvious his mother made him incredibly happy. But regardless of the reason for these strangers to be lurking around their property, the Pleskovic family was now totally on edge and found themselves constantly looking out the windows, especially at night, in fear these strangers were going to come back and might try to break in again. And unfortunately, these strangers would come back. In January of 2017, so 2 months after Anna saw that unknown figure at the window and heard the back door sliding around, Bruce's car was broken into. It was sitting in the driveway of their property. Someone got inside of it and stole his laptop. And so Bruce, he calls the police and he says, I've got to believe this has to do with the people that are harassing my family. And the police believed him and they began looking around and asking around, but they could never track down the laptop or the thief. And so once again, the family was kind of left on their own. And the police said, look, if you see anything else, let us know. But there's not much we can do here. A few months later, in July of that year, Anna, Jeff, and their daughter were all home together one night when Anna happened to look out one of the back windows on their first floor, and out on the very back of the property were 3 strangers just standing in that same spot where they saw those 4 strangers smoking the year before. And these 3 strangers are just standing there looking up at the house. And so horrified, Anna calls out to Jeff and says, look, there are 3 people in the back of our property. And so Anna, she pulls out her phone and she's calling the police. And as she's calling the police, Jeff, who's totally upset that there are these people harassing him and his family and making them feel unsafe, he just grabs a flashlight and storms out the back door to go confront these people. But as soon as Jeff went out the back door, before he could even shine the light on them, the 3 people had turned and ran and vanished. And so finally, when the police did show up, they were aware of all the calls they had gotten from this family. And so they went out there and they did a serious search for these 3 strangers, but like always, nothing was found. And so the family once again was told, if you see anything else, let us know. The following month, which was August, Anna was home with her daughter, along with her mother, who was upstairs. And as Anna is in the front of the house in the playroom with her daughter, she hears the sound of somebody trying to open that back sliding door. And now immediately her radar is up because she knows what happened the last time she heard the sound. There was that person in the window. But she's thinking, okay, I can't just immediately call the police. I need to at least look and see if there's someone that I know at the back door. And so she scoops her daughter up, she stands up, and she walks around to the edge of the room she's in, and she kind of peeks her head down this hallway that will give her a clear view of this back sliding glass door. And once she finally has a full view of whoever is there, she screams because there are 2 large adults, as she would say, standing at the back door trying to force open this door. And so when she screams, these 2 strangers, they hear it, they turn around and they run. And Melinda, she was upstairs, she hears her daughter screaming, she comes flying downstairs, she's trying to figure out what's going on. Anna is hysterical, the baby's crying, and so Melinda actually calls the police about what her daughter has just seen. The police come out, they search the property, they can't find anyone, and so again, the police leave and they tell the family, look, I'm sorry this is happening to you, but we can't do anything. So please just let us know if anything else happens and we'll be out here as soon as we can. We're bound to catch these people, but right now we just don't have much to operate on. The following month, which was September, one of Melinda's car keys would go missing. And whoever had these keys, whoever had stolen these keys, would use it to randomly start Melinda's car in the middle of the night. And they also used it to set off her car alarm at odd hours of the night. And then also during this time frame that her keys were missing, they also discovered that there were nails jammed into the tires of Bruce's car. And so of course, the family calls the police and tells them about what's going on, but the police can't do anything. And so very frustrated, Melinda actually takes to Facebook and posts that someone's stolen her keys and please just give them back. And just overall, she's pleading with whoever is harassing her family to just leave them alone. But unfortunately, this post would not do anything. The harassment would continue. A month later, on October 19th, Jeff was home alone when he heard the sound of the backsliding glass door rattling. And now he knows that every time this has been heard by Anna, that there's always some stranger at the back door. And so Jeff grabs the family dog and he very carefully turns and looks down that hallway towards the back door to see who this is. And right as he pokes his head out, he sees there's this large adult figure with a hood up trying to open this back door. And so the dog sees this person and starts barking and running towards the door. Jeff runs after the dog, and this big person outside who's trying to break in, he sees the dog, he sees Jeff running, and he turns and he runs away. And so Jeff and the dog, they stay inside the house and they watch this guy just take off across the property and disappear into the trees. And Jeff would call the police, but like always, the police came out and there just was nothing they could do. 4 days later, on October 23rd, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Bruce, they went to the local Applebee's where Anna worked to have dinner there and have Anna wait on them. And then after they were done eating, they said their goodbyes to Anna, they left the restaurant, they hopped in their cars, and they drove back to their house. When they got there, Bruce was the first up the steps, and he got to the front door and it was locked, and so he knocked, and Kyle, his son, he came and unlocked the door. Bruce went inside, followed closely behind by Jeff, who was holding his daughter. They get inside and Bruce walks through the house to the back of the house where the kitchen is. He flips on the lights and there's something on the kitchen floor. And when Jeff sees it, he immediately turns around and runs out of the house carrying his daughter. He grabs Kyle along the way and just takes them straight out of the house. And then once Jeff was outside, he called 911. And when you listen to his 911 call, it sounds like Jeff is unable to process what he has just seen.
911, what's the address of your emergency?
Somebody's been attacked in my house.
Somebody's been what?
Attacked.
They attacked who? Who was attacked?
Mel Pleskovic. Mel Pleskovic was attacked.
He was attacked by whom? Do you know?
No, we just came home. She's on the kitchen floor.
Jeff and Bruce had just discovered Melinda lying on the kitchen floor. She'd been stabbed over 35 times and shot 3 times. She would be rushed to the hospital, but she would die that night. Although the family was in shock and couldn't even begin to process what had just happened, they were all acutely aware that whoever had done this to Melinda had to be connected to all of these strange and suspicious people that had been lurking around their property for the better part of 2 years. In fact, literally after Jeff had called 911, Bruce was inside in the kitchen kneeling next to his dying wife, and he called 911 and he would tell the dispatcher that the Strongsville Police Department really dropped the ball.
911, what city is the emergency in?
Please come to one for Blazing Star. I think my wife's dead. Someone, we had people breaking into our f***ing house,
sir.
And now someone killed her.
Sir, tell me the city you need to talk to.
Strongsville, Ohio.
Okay, you need to be transferred. Don't hang up.
911, what's the city of your emergency?
Strongsville, Ohio. We have people on the way already.
What's the address?
For Blazing Star. I think someone killed my wife.
You think someone killed your wife?
Yeah, it looks like she has stab wounds on her back. We've had people trying to break into our house all year.
Sir, I need to ask you questions, okay? Are you there right now?
I just got in the door with my new son-in-law. My son Kyle was here with us.
Sir, what I want you to do is walk outside.
The Strongsville Police Department would come out in force for this case, and they would solve it in just 4 days. And when they went public with who killed Melinda, no one could believe it. Back on October 23rd, so this was the night Melinda was discovered, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Melinda and her son Kyle, they were all together in the house. And at some point, Jeff had put his daughter down in her playpen and then went into the kitchen where Melinda was, and he walked up to her, pulled out a knife, and stabbed her over 35 times. And then when Melinda fell to the ground, Jeff drew a gun and shot her 3 additional times to make sure she was dead. Now, while he was doing this, his daughter is literally just a few feet away, and Kyle, presumably, is also right nearby, but he has no way of understanding what's happening to his mother. And so with these 2 totally innocent lives just right nearby, Jeff would clean off his weapons and he'd take off his bloody clothes and he would hide them inside of his car, and then he would just scoop up his daughter and he would leave the house, leaving Kyle alone in the house with his dying mother in the kitchen, just leaves him there, shuts the door, locks it, and then Jeff and his daughter would drive to Applebee's to have dinner with Melinda's husband and her daughter. And then after several hours, when they got back to the property, Jeff knew what was waiting for them inside, and he still allowed Bruce to go inside first and discover his dying wife on the kitchen floor. Very little is known about why Jeff did this, because Jeff has actually never come out and given his motive for the crime. The running theory is that Jeff actually was not going to be able to pay for the wedding, which was coming up in a couple of days, and the wedding venue had actually contacted Melinda and said, hey, we're canceling the wedding because your future son-in-law can't pay for it. And so Melinda apparently confronted Jeff about his financial troubles, and the theory is he snapped and killed her. However, that can't possibly be the entire story for why he did this, because it would turn out Jeff was found to be responsible for literally every single suspicious event that had taken place around the Pleskovic property leading up to the attack. Meaning, every time they had seen strangers lurking around their property or people trying to break into their house, that had been because of Jeff. Either it was literally Jeff outside being one of these suspicious people, or he had asked friends or hired someone or groups of people to pretend to be suspicious people on the property, or Jeff had been the only person to see these suspicious people, and then miraculously when other people attempted to look outside, they were gone. And so obviously Jeff was lying. And so I actually had the opportunity to speak with one of Jeff's childhood friends who was actually living roughly in the Strongsville area when this horrible murder took place. And what this person told me is that what is kind of generally accepted as why Jeff did this, according to the people in Strongsville, is that Jeff apparently loathed Melinda. Even though she had opened her house to him, he loathed her. And as soon as he moved in 2016, he began plotting to kill her. And so all of these suspicious events were Jeff's attempt at building this really intricate alibi that they had these strangers out there that were targeting this family. And so that when she would ultimately be killed by him, it would look like these strangers had done it. And at first, it totally worked. Everybody believed, the police, the family, friends, that strangers had broken into the house and killed Melinda. In fact, there was so little suspicion on Jeff after her murder that Jeff actually served as a pallbearer in Melinda's funeral. But ultimately, the police would discover the knife and some bloody clothes in the back of Jeff's car, and so they would arrest him and they would present this mountain of evidence against him, and Jeff would confess to killing Melinda. However, he wouldn't give any additional information about the crime. He would just basically say, yes, I did kill her. He would also never give an apology or explanation to the family. He would ultimately be sentenced to life in prison with the opportunity for parole after 33 years. During Jeff's trial, there was this totally heartbreaking moment when Bruce, Melinda's husband, spoke. And he would say their son, Kyle, does not understand that his mother is gone. And so now, every time they go out to eat, which is something Kyle really likes to do, and he used to love doing with his mother, he'll just sit and stare out the window, eagerly expecting his mother to show up any minute. But of course, she never does.